But this brings up a very interesting story. You haven't asked me the question, where did snowboarding come from? And I'll answer that question.
Well, Sherman, I'm so glad we had this chance to sit down and talk at a historic moment in history when your collection of vintage snurfers and the patent documents and the marketing materials are on their way to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. But I was hoping we could start and just have you take us back to Christmas Day 1965, because I understand that's where the story of the snurfer really begins.
I'd love to tell you the story. Actually, had two children, 10 and 5, and a third child on the way, and my wife and I she had become toxic. Our H factor was different, and so they were going to take the baby December 28th. Now you can imagine Christmas Day, 2 kids, and a wife who's all pretty uptight. And she basically said, Sherman, you've got to get these kids out of the house. So boom, we're out of the house. Most of the toys are already messed up. And we had had a huge snowstorm on the shores of Lake Michigan. So we got the sled out, but the sled would cut through the snow and hit the sand because there are dunes behind the house and wouldn't slide. And I looked over and I saw my oldest daughter, Wendy's little 32-inch bubble pack type skis from Kmart, and I ended up saying, we'll use these somehow. And I turned around and I looked, and having lived on the shore of Lake Michigan my whole life, I was a false surfer, actually. And if I could tell you why it happens, I had no idea, but suddenly it said, you know, that hill, the dune behind the house is a permanent wave. If you could get up there, you could ride that wave all day long. So I put these 2 little skis together and braced them, and in effect, we started riding down the dune, as my patent ended up saying, perpendicular to the direction of travel.
They must have been disappointed in what Santa left under the tree that morning.
Well, they just had such a good time. And then the neighborhood kids came in, they wanted to play on it. But anyway, that night, my wife dreamed up the contraction of snow and surf, and the name Snurfer was born. Back then, skis had a groove down the middle, and I was playing with woodworking. I had routing tools, and I was taking water skis and putting grooves down so the board would track better and would go straight. And then one day, within that week, my dad came over. He just lived down the street, and he was up on the hill sliding with us. He says, this is really stupid. You fall off and the board goes down the hill. And it was his idea to put the lanyard or tether off the front, which turned out to be wonderful because if you fell down, you just held on to the rope. And you could sort of pull it and then swing it, and you'd sort of steer the board a little bit that way. But at the same time, you were doing the exact snowboard moves you do today, rock and rolling on your heel and toe. But there were no bindings or anything on it. You've got to realize they're just standing on a board.
Had you already been an inventor? Were you tinkering with other inventions?
Yes, I had made a product for the welding industry, and I had a patent and a trademark on that, and that turned out to make me much more money than the snurfer ever made me.
When did it click in your mind that this might have a commercial application?
Well, fortunately, the snow kept coming, and as any rider today will tell you, that a snowboard and powder is about one of the greatest experiences you could have. Well, it was the same on the snurfer. And putting all these things together and playing in the dunes, it was just a tremendous amount of fun. And pretty soon, we'd have a 6-pack and go up in the dune. and we used to joke, this is too much fun, someday this will be in the Olympics. Well, here we are. I sold the snurfer rights to Brunswick on a royalty basis, and they ran a full half-page cartoon of the kid coming in to the sledding hill and getting on it, and having, look, I can steer what I can do, and then all the sled kids, oh, I want one, and that was one of their advertisements.
It was easy for families of modest means to buy a snurfer for their kids.
Patent and applications, everything were started in March of '66, and by Christmas of '66, the yellow and black snurfer, the one that's really hard to find now, was on the market for Christmas, and that sold for $5.70. And you can go on eBay, and if you can find one in decent shape, yellow and black striped, in decent shape, for $200 or $300, you're lucky. Everybody's collecting them now. It's really sort of interesting what's going on. In the middle '80s, Paul Graves and I, he was one of the original riders of the snurfer on the East Coast. We still formed a corporation called Snurfer USA and tried to bring it back out with a whole different design, little bit different design and everything, with little rubber bands to put your feet under rather than the tether.
I want to stop you, Sherman, because you said something very interesting very quickly. I think you said you experimented with rubber bands to create bindings for the snurfer. First, that sounds remarkably simplistic, but also it's a foreshadowing, again, of the modern snowboard, where, of course, bindings are critical to the way people ride today. You must have had a sense in your mind.
Well, let me tell you, in 1979, now this is 14 years after the patents were on, at one of our college competitions in Western Michigan, Jake Burton Carpenter and 3 buddies came to the contest, and this was a downhill and a slalom at a state park. And Jake brought snurfers, but he had cut an inner tube and made a thing to slip your foot under and nailed it to the snurfer. So in effect, he had a little binding. Well, that was pretty important. He also, because this thing was only 32 inches long and 7 inches wide, it was for children's feet, he made some boards longer and wider, and he brought these to the downhill. Well, since they weren't snurfers, they weren't going to let them play or compete. And I said, look, the guy's coming all the way from this young guys, they were all 17 years old, and Jake had been given a snurfer by his father when he was 14, and he just grew up on it. And in fact, if you go in his factory in Vermont, he has a memory wall, and the very first thing in that memory wall is his original snurfer. But the most important thing was he was there with this idea of putting something over the top, because you just stood on staples. I mean, you just stood there in your galoshes or your Sorels and rode the thing, holding on to the rope.
So Jake Burton got involved very directly through the snurfer. Yeah. Did you guys have a good relationship through the whole development of?
We've remained good friends. We had a wonderful photo shoot for Vanity Fair at Vail a few years ago, and that was a lot of fun. But this brings up a very interesting story. You haven't asked me the question, where did snowboarding come from? And I'll answer that question. In 1979, there was no sport known as snowboarding. The whole thing was called snurfing, and you owned a snurfer, and you as a person were a snurfer. And that name just caught on. In fact, the name turned out to be more valuable. People kept trying to buy that name from me, but I wouldn't sell it. But anyway, so here comes Jake with his stuff, and he goes back to Vermont, and he starts manufacturing snurfboards. Well, I owned the word snurf and any derivative thereof, because we were going to have snurf gloves, snurf mittens, snurf scarves. So I had my patent attorney write his, and hey, Jake, you can make all those snurfboards you want, but you're going to pay Sherman royalty each time you use the word snurf. So what did the guy do? He called it a snowboard. So that's how the snowboard actually got started. And to this day, I'm really ticked off that I ever wrote that letter.
It seems clear to me that even though there's some profound irony there. You don't resent Jake Burton for moving on.
No, I'll tell you, I thank him forever because of the energy and the devotion and the sacrifice this young man went through, because it was his drive that got us on the chairlift. Otherwise, we'd still be walking up the hill. And so the world, every rider should thank Jake Burton for getting him on a chairlift.
And when was the last snurfer, production assembly line snurfer made?
It was made, let's see, 79, about 81 was really the end. And by then, Burton boards, he was now marketing. They were wider, longer. They had, plastic bottoms, and they were, Sims was manufacturing, Chuck Barfoot in California was manufacturing, and Winter Stick was out. They were all trying to, but every single one of these guys had been on the snurfer first. I mean, it just, and in the James Bond movie, I think it was Dr. No, Tom Sims, he's riding a snowboard and with the bad guys behind him, and the James. So it was starting to getting some recognition.
And during your years in Steamboat, were you a snowboarder?
I didn't start snowboarding. No, I was a hardcore tree skier, and I started snowboarding when I was 65 years old, and I never looked back.
How does it make you feel, though, to realize that this invention that came about on a whim on a Christmas morning all those many years ago, more than 40 years ago, now has created a permanent, really, legacy for you?
Well, it's just very, very exciting to think that, this all started in my little workshop back in Muskegon, Michigan. But it's just very, very heartwarming, and it's just huge. What they're doing on the board, the jumping and the way they've adapted it, well, another wonderful thing I'm very happy about, I think probably the snowboard has economically saved many a ski area, because they're now running 40% of ticket sales. And just last winter, I had the privilege of cutting the ribbon at Taos, because they can now ride at Taos. In fact, I have a T-shirt that, when they started, the owner, Blake's, the own Taos, it'll be hell will freeze over before we'll ever have a snowboard. And the T-shirts were so great. Hell is frozen. And I have one of those.